So thanks again for joining us for the UIC Alumni Exchange Program. My name is Karen Corman, and I have the privilege of being the Executive Director of your UIC Alumni Association. Welcome to the UIC Alumni Exchange Series. Through our Alumni Exchange Series, we work to bring our alumni and friends a variety of programs and topics so you can explore, connect, and even escape from the everyday with a community of UIC alumni, staff, faculty, experts. You'll hear me say this a few times today, and I'll put it in the chat here in a moment, but I encourage you to visit go.uic.edu/alumni exchange for the latest and the greatest programming. And with that, I'm really excited to start our program this afternoon as we are joined by two-time alumnus, Alan Jones. Alan is here to discuss the background dynamics of AI interviews and how you can best prepare for them as screening job candidates is becoming increasingly more automated and sometimes performed by artificial intelligence tools. Thank you so much, Alan, for being with us today, and I'll turn it over to you to begin the program.
All right. Hi, everybody, and thank you, Karen, and to the rest of the alumni staff there. And thank you for joining me and explaining the topic today. Mastering the AI-based interview, or also called automated video interview. So I'm a two-time alumnus, as Karen mentioned. So what I hope to cover is how to understand this type of interview format, how it's different, and how to help candidates interface with it successfully, because I believe that it is a different preparation that hasn't really been talked about and formalized yet. I'm learning it, but and I'm certainly not a expert at it. I'm not employed by one of the companies that are vendors for this. My interests are finding reasons to like it because I believe it has a lot of great benefits in preparing for it. And my background is a university career counselor, so I work with students and alumni in their job search communications and career decision making. And I guess my focus has always been in working with them on reflection questions so that they have more ways to talk about themselves in whatever way they're interfacing with employers. It never occurred to me, though, in my wildest dreams that a few years ago that AI might find an application in interviewing. So we'll talk about why that's now very much the case. And as we know, video-based communication is quite the norm. And so this format is growing quickly with that change that we've all experienced over the last few years. All right. So just some basic information about automated video interviews, or AVIs. I'll just use that term. Here's on the left, you'll notice some brand names. And you would, if you were a candidate, you would see these kinds of names. I think the two biggest are HireVue and Modern Hire. And TallView is, I think, a private label company that does a lot of, so if you got an interview through Indeed or LinkedIn, they would be the ones behind that. So overall, what do these interviews do? They evaluate a candidate's word choice. They use a psychological model called the Big Five. And I'll show you a little bit about that in the next few slides. But the Big Five are traits that are measured on a spectrum. And these are openness to new experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and emotional stability, basically. And then there's a few value and needs theories that they throw in as well. So there are many vendors offering these. There hasn't been a shakeout in this industry yet, and I'm sure that's coming. The largest employers now, the Fortune 1000, have been the early adopters because they have been they're the most impacted by any efficiency that they can find. And even if they didn't use the AI features of these platforms and they just used the ability to record the video to review later by a human, the efficiencies by themselves would justify the cost of these systems. So there has been a lot of controversy around these. When they first came out, this interview format included facial action, meaning they would look at your face and measure the movement in your facial action, as they called it. And they had, it's a term that's kind of technical. It was called facial action units. And this goes back to a theory from the 80s called from Paul Ekman that would associate what your facial action, how it corresponded to an emotion. Also, they would measure nonverbals, meaning the pitch, the rate of speech, your inflection, those kinds of things, many others. And they were trying to find what was predictive. It's all possible due to machine learning now. I think the controversy around these was too great, and the leading companies at least have moved back from this type of measurement, and so they only measure words and word choice and how those words correspond to the Big Five. In the midst of all this, recently, the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has opened up an inquiry, and they are trying to set some standards. I don't think they're going to banish this. They set recently they came out with some suggested guidelines for employers to meet the American with Disabilities Act and how to use these tools with that. There'll be some forthcoming guidance documents related to algorithm fairness and algorithm auditing. That's become its own occupation and quite complicated, more than a layperson can speak to. So that brings up a good point. I am not much more than a layperson. I've written some papers, though, with the chief psychologist at HireVue, the leading company in this little niche. And I've learned from that. I've grown in my understanding, but I really don't know how the algorithm works, and other than what I've explained about the Big Five. And so I can't answer technical questions, but I think they're worth asking. So don't stop asking them, but I don't know if I'll have answers for them. So we're moving on here. So the dynamics of this interview, they are usually about 20 to 25 minutes long. They ask about 6 or 7 questions, and you have typically about 3 minutes to respond. So if you know about behavior-based questions, these are a question type that require a story, because they usually begin with, tell me about a time. So tell me about a time when you worked with a group and one member of the group wasn't holding up their end of the duties they were assigned, or tell me about a time when you had to overcome some stress as part of your work. They're looking for a situation in the past, and they want to know how you handled it. Now, this was very common in human-to-human interviews, it still is, because they're looking for your problem solving and some authentic moment that you can express. It's a way to get around some of the posing and the formality that happens naturally in a high-stakes interview. Why do they use the same format here? It's for a slightly different reason. Since you are espousing a story, typically for answering a behavior-based question, you're using quite a lot of words and a diversity of words. So that helps them correspond those words to the traits that they're trying to pick up. So it takes a while to express a story, and that's why they have maintained that. It's natural as well. People are used to being coached to use the STAR method usually in answering behavior-based questions, which is STAR stands for situation, task, action, result. And that's kind of a basic plot line. We'll go over that in a little bit, but I want to revisit that. But that's how behavior-based questions have evolved and migrated into this new format. So you won't be able to see what's on the left side, but I wanted to show you what a employer would see. This was a report in the old days from Tallview. And I'll just point this out. You won't be able to see, but here are the Big Five. Each of these little blocks are the Big Five. So openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and well, they call it emotional range here. And now each one of those has 6 facets that are independently measured. So in this one about conscientiousness, there's one for achievement striving or cautiousness, or dutifulness. Here on the left are some of the needs and values that they are also measuring. Hedonism is a good and funny one, I think. Self-enhancement, structure, self-expression, practicality. So here you can see how this person would have measured or been measured on each of these kinds of things. So you're ranked as a candidate with this, and that's what the employer will see, is a ranking with a score. So why do they use this? If it were difficult to create an algorithm that was bias-free, and there is a lack of transparency, why are they going to all this length to do this? And that's because they believe, the psychologists that are really behind this, is that there's less bias with this type of system, the AI-based machine learning system, than there would be with human raters. And a really good example is this slide I have here. So here you see a question or a candidate's ranking. On the left, this was done by human raters, and on the right by the AI system. Now, there's a nice distribution. They're usually measured from 1 to 5. And you can see that this is a nice distribution, pretty even, that the AI does. But what do humans do? They typically will rank a candidate as a 3 or 4. And they typically don't want to rank candidates so much on the positive side or so much on the negative side. So you very rarely see a human rater give a 5 or a 2 or a 1. And that's just the way it happens. Right? I mean, this tendency for human raters to gravitate to the middle. You can see this probably in your own habits when you have to fill out a Likert scale on a survey and you kind of group it in the middle. So that is one form of bias, but there are many other forms of bias that are more obvious and insidious. And we hope that the AI's algorithm, while not being bias-free, is less biased than a human would be. So I think at this point, there's a survey coming up. Yeah, so you should see that. So we're just trying to, if you've heard of AI systems, or at least from this short description I've given to you, if that's your first go around with this kind of format, what's your reaction when you first heard about AI interviews? Maybe you had no feeling that they were stigmatic at all and you're fine with it. I know that was my first reaction, but I don't know if that's true for most people. Just give it a few more seconds. Okay, I guess we'll. So it looks like it's a bad first impression. That's the #1 pick. And, you know, I'll tell you that it is probably true that you're not going to see a human with this kind of format for quite a while, even though you're going to have a few touch points with the employer. But followed by amplifying bias, and that this should be reserved as a human task and not by a machine. But glad to see that some of you like this format and don't see any problem. That's how I look at it, and I'm going to go into that kind of thing now. So we can get rid of that. All right, so true that this is often a first impression of the employer that a candidate sees, and it's become a shifting starting point for for any for candidates. Karen, I don't know, did you want to see if there are any questions? Should we cover that before I move on?
I haven't seen any questions yet, but I'll just encourage, if there are any questions, please put them in chat and then I'll jump in.
Okay, yeah, please.
Thank you though for checking.
Send them in as we go. We can interrupt. I don't have to reserve them to the end.
Thank you.
Anyway, so resumes are still the formal starting point of most job candidacies, or the candidate pipeline, as employers might call it. But they've really become too limited. And that's just because the nature of work is changing. As we have moved to project-based work, and where people come together for a limited amount of time to work on a project, as employers or consumers want something that's personalized, customized to their liking, these projects keep coming up. Now, a lot of it is repeated because there are best practices, but we still have to customize it for the customer. So that takes a lot of human interaction and creativity. And that's the kind of traits, those associated traits that are being measured in some ways. Also, that the skills that employees need now are always changing. Skills have become ever more important. Even though knowledge has been codified by a software package, skills seem to always be important to employees. And the problem is they go obsolete a lot faster now. After 3 or 4 years, you're going to kind of come up with some new skills to keep up. Well, employers, they want to hire people who will keep learning. And that's part of the reason for these packages. Willingness to learn, or learning agility, as it's formally known, is a big reason that these systems are being adopted. Conscientiousness, as part of the big five, is translated into something that's important to employers too, like the drive to results. Along with all of the changes that have come in the nature of work is this ambiguity about what is happening. There's a lot of uncertainty in workplaces as things keep changing. So the ability to handle that ambiguity and keep your composure is very important. So this is another trait that's necessary for employers to measure. I think they had to make a guess before, and now they've got some clues at least, and they can screen candidates this way. And that's why these are done at the beginning. A resume can't express these. A resume is a legacy of the 20th century and the knowledge economy, where people showed what they knew and how they might serve somebody who needed that knowledge. And that's just, while that's not totally obsolete, that's just not enough anymore. Video and your voice make this an easy way to gather data rather than a written assessment. Then the results are used in the same way. But candidates often would not sit through a written assessment that wasn't part of the natural interview process. So video now has made it so much easier to gather this data. Also, the improvement in your voice transcription. So like the word bank. A bank has at least 3 different meanings, right? You can talk about bank as a bounce, right? Bank shot in pool. A bank might be on a river, and a bank might be something you take a deposit or withdrawal from. There's several ways to interpret that word, but so they have the science now that they can understand the semantic context of how you're using that. So all these things have come together to allow this to be a fairly reliable screening device if it's used at the beginning of the interview or the candidate pipeline. These are some of the competencies that are being measured. Some of these are fairly normal. You would always think of these as competencies at the top. You would see these often, a team and communication. And schools are making a big deal about trying to infuse these more into classroom assignments, or to offer programs to their students so that there's more awareness of the need for this. But you can see as you go down the list, there are different ones that are not covered by those more well-known things like communication and teamwork. And I mentioned some of those at the bottom: willingness to learn and composure. Safety and compliance, like, nursing would be a good one for that, right? There's a lot of procedures that need to be followed in nursing. They would want to hire somebody who wouldn't go rogue, try to be a hero and save the patient with something that wasn't part of the procedure that was vetted by the hospital. So you can see that there are some ways to get a gauge on a candidate with this format. All right, well, let's go on. Now, what I like about this format on the left is, since this is a performance really by the individual, there's nobody at the other end. Even afterwards, there is typically nobody watching the video that you have made as a candidate for the entire length of all of the responses. Okay, now they do it, they might, and especially as they are newer to this format, but as they get used to it, they know that the system is delivering the candidates they want, so they start to trust it. They would only want to look at your video as a candidate to make sure that you weren't doing something weird, like reading responses from a paper, or worse, having somebody off screen lip syncing. They'd want to get a sense of your style before they would meet you as a finalist, because that's the final interview is still a human-to-human interview, and in this process, this is only a screening device. But the lack of social conventions, this ability to be a performer and to almost have a dialogue with yourself, allows you to do so much more as a candidate, to express more about yourself, not just those things about work and school. So another thing about the predicting is that the algorithm is customized to each position, and it's relatively robust. So within 130 seconds or 2 minutes and 10 seconds, they can pretty much gather enough words. Now, this is a little bit of my own lack of understanding. I can't tell you if that window of time is different based on the education or the vocabulary skills of the candidate. We don't know. This was a measure that's on the universal set of candidates that HireVue has analyzed. So I wouldn't know how that might change with a candidate that has tried to intentionally diversify their income, not income, but their vocabulary. And that's what we're going to talk about next, is how to do that. But anyway, after 130 seconds, there's a little bit of a declining return to additional words. The algorithm has pretty much got enough to analyze and make a decision and rank the candidate. So, moving on. So the strategy here is to make meaning. Since you've got 3 minutes and you're in a performance mode, make some meaning, which means try to, in this case, deliver as many words as possible. But you've got to, of course, it's reality. You can't hope that you can espouse some fancy words. I don't mean that. I want you to, everybody would want you to be talking naturally. So the strategy for diversifying your words is really more about injecting or infusing in your own preferences and favorites into your response, and using a symbolic set of words to do that. So in my work with students and alumni, I've always done this, trying to use these reflection questions and to see how these kinds of questions reveal something about the candidate, and to copy down and save and preserve the labels that they provide. So you can see there's 6 or 7 questions here. So favorite saying, favorite movie, favorite TV show, a role model. So for instance, a role model for me, well, I like runners. I find runners to be a role model, not any particular runner, but just runners in general. And I find them to be meditative and focused and determined, um, resilient, solitary. So that's more than enough words. But I think though, if you can preserve the words that for these, they are easy to infuse into the language of your response as you're giving a behavior-based question. So I used one of those words before, or one of those questions before. Tell me about a time when you were working in a group project and somebody didn't hold up their end of the bargain or their duties. You're going to give a story, and you're going to try to invest or imbue the words from here. It won't take much, but as we go through the story, we have different pieces of the story where we can put this in. And I'm going to go over an outline for that in a second. Also, you have some chance at the end of the story to provide some takeaways. And so there's more room for these kinds of words at the end with those takeaways. So what does this do? What does this meaning making or sense making provide as a strategy? They're metaphorical. They provide a succinct way. So if you could, if I were to say, well, that kind of situation relates to me because I've always found that runners fit my my way of attacking or working toward the goal, and I can use some of those labels. So it's a very metaphorical and brief way because you only have 3 minutes to talk, and you want to be able to say it in a clear and concise way. Adds another layer of words, and it's performative. Also, there's a sense of divergence, and we're not trying to surprise anybody because we don't expect a lot of employers to be watching, but the divergence will help diversify your word choice just by using some personal situations. Okay, I don't know if I feel like I should stop, and if anybody else has a question, it's a good time to put it in here, or should I just keep going?
I don't see a question. There was a comment, but I don't see a question.
Okay. All right. Moving on. So we're really talking about improvisation. I think that is the best benefit to this kind of format. You really don't have to be too concerned about what people are thinking. If you were in a human-to-human interview, you would probably be hesitant to use a role model to describe something. You never know who this person as a stranger is, and you wouldn't know if that person had any understanding of your role model. If they're a celebrity, if your role model is a celebrity, they probably do have an impression. You don't know what that would be, so you might be hesitant to use it. And the richness of your dialogue is curtailed then. But in an AI interview, you don't have to worry about that. So you're really using all the answers to those questions and more to improve your improvisational ability and use your imagination to answer that question that you're given. So it's really a second order cognitive style. They call that dialogical self. It really is almost you talking with yourself through different voices. And there's already some good theory and grounding for this approach, to talking about texturizing your understanding and how it can be, your self-knowledge and how that can be applied in an interview setting. So this is really taking this format and showing how it can really boost your self-understanding. And now, you know, I almost think it's kind of a waste that it's only a machine who's listening to it, because I mean, and the actual candidate, of course, who's speaking it. That is kind of the beauty of it, is by speaking the identity to the AI, they're getting some benefit for themselves. So storytelling, obviously, we've talked about that. When I've worked with students, I find that they have trouble often staying in the story. And I don't know if, I think this gets better as a person or an individual gets older. But it seems like a traditional age college student tries to rush towards the outcome, the end, the result, and using that STAR method. The result is the end of the story. And I think that in this case, since we want to diversify our income, I keep saying income, diversify our word choice, we want to make sure we're staying in each part of the story so that we are not shortchanging ourselves to be able to diversify. So let me show you the graph I was mentioning later. So in this case, so I made a little change. I had been speaking earlier about the STAR method, situation, task, action, result. But I'm going to propose that this is a better way. Situation, obstacle, action, result. Nicely, it spells SOAR, so it's still got an easy to remember acronym. And I would put at the end sort of epilogue or takeaway as a way to follow up from the results. So by showing this, you can kind of see what I mean by whipsawing your story. Just when you get to the obstacle as a strategy, you want to include all the emotional qualities of a story as it unfolded. You were presented with an assignment or a situation that you're recounting in the story, but there was some hardship, there was some uncertainty. That's what you're overcoming with the action. So you want to think about it as an obstacle so that you can think about and espouse the emotional qualities that you had and the uncertainty that you were experiencing. These are all ways to give more words that you wouldn't normally do, especially if you were speaking to a human. You would probably try to make yourself sound neutral and resilient. But now you don't need to worry about that. You can express these. So there's a rising action from the obstacle as you take on a strategy to address the situation and you achieve some results. In this case, it doesn't have to be a positive ending. You had some results, maybe it didn't work out as well as you thought, but that doesn't matter since nobody's watching. You don't have to show some optimistic outcome. It's just the results, and they will have to speak for themselves as the algorithm measures the words you chose and then makes the meaning at the end. So if you follow that formula, you will definitely diversify your word choice then. So there is some research that supports this too. So this is rather recent. There is a whole line of psychology specialization called narrative psychology. And one of the leading researchers of this is Dan McLean, who works at Northwestern University. And so he has found that agreeableness, some of the big 5 factors, agreeableness, conscientiousness, extroversion, are related to the rising action we saw in that previous graph and to the high point, which would be the result. And also openness and agreeableness are also related to the low points, the low point, the obstacle in my graph. So there is some research, I think this is rather new. So when I say dichotomizing the story, I mean, try to make sure you put in a low point. Don't be afraid to talk about those vulnerable times when you were just trying to strategize about an action. And relate the good times, the results, and the takeaways. Stretch that out as much as you can so that you're providing more words. Okay. So I'm wrapping up here. I just want to, so I think it's important still to talk about some of the benefits and the discomforts of this kind of format. I've mentioned it provides a safe environment, if you were to look at it that way, free of the social conventions of humans with humans and the uncertainties of relating to a stranger. I think interestingly, there is no need to think about personal branding here either. Your brand is revealed by the algorithm. You're not trying to influence anybody. You're just trying to, your strategy is simply to diversify your word choice in a natural way, in a coherent way. But you don't have to influence anybody. You don't have to provide declarative statements about your value system, thinking, well, that's probably what they feel too. They have the same values. I can show up on time, get things done, meet deadlines. You don't have to make, we always put those kinds of things into our resume. They're often in the summary section as the second line, that, you're detail oriented. I find that, that is one of the most overused words. You don't have to make those kinds of statements anymore. Now we only have to make coherent and contextualized statements. And I think we haven't really explored this very much, but this kind of opens up all the idea of how to tell a story. Who knows? Maybe there are many other ways. I showed you a basic plot outline, but the TED Talk, for instance, is a different kind of story model. TED Talk often starts with, I wonder if, or have you ever thought about whether, these are kinds of opening lines to TED Talks. You wouldn't use that kind of opening line in a typical interview response, but perhaps now, with nobody's listening to your response on an AI system, maybe there are different ways to open up stories now. So I think, getting over the idea that there's no reciprocity, no audience, no dialogue, that's certainly something to get used to, because that's what we're used to as humans. And, it's just different now. So I think finally, there is a bit of implication to this format. If the screening, and I'm sure the screening will get better, the measures for validity and reliability will improve. And I think it really does take on a sense of a measurement of authenticity for the role. But not, if you think of career as purpose, then perhaps then these are sort of proxy measurements for that, because they do relate to a candidate's predicted job performance and their likelihood of turning over. And I think a good example is nursing, right? Nursing, as we've all seen in the pandemic, really suffers for turnover, and has always had that problem, but especially exacerbated by the demands that have been put on nurses over the pandemic. But if a hospital could do just a little bit of improvement to predict turnover, just change that percentage turnover by 1%, the savings for them would be profound. So I'm pretty sure that for all these reasons, AI interviews will be becoming a big part. They'll be accelerating. They'll be adopted by more and more strata of companies. The mid-sized companies are next, and those mid-sized companies are like hospitals. So you will start to see this kind of tool in that kind of setting, and I'm sure it'll filter down to smaller companies as the price of these products get a little easier to absorb. But that's the longer term, and the larger question is, how much does this format, the AI interview, really determine a candidate's compatibility with their purpose? Or are they really just going into this career because it offers the benefits of job stability and a good income, which are not good reasons, but that's a reality for many job candidates and students. They pick those kinds of majors for that reason. And now it brings up, a lot of ethical questions about how we should advise students. And that's something that I'm really hoping there's a dialogue about in the future, knowing that they're going to face these kinds of things. And, how do we relate to them while they're still a student when we know this? So that's the end of the presentation.
Well, thank you so much, Alan. This is such an interesting conversation, and you brought up so much really good data and points for everybody to sort of ponder and kind of think about as you were talking. I couldn't help thinking we used to do alumni programs about just how to have a good handshake and what it meant to have a really strong handshake and what that looked like, and how this is just changing all of that, right? And the idea of strategic storytelling and really thinking about, I thought your example of a TED Talk was really good, because you would never start out in an interview question saying, have you thought about, because that would come across to, I think, to another human being like, what you're telling me, have I thought about something? One of the questions that came across, and I had a similar thought in my own mind, is, you can go online and you can take practice tests for driver's ed, for getting your driver's license. Are there any sites that offer a preview or a trial to help you gauge how you might perform in an AI interview that you might recommend? Because I imagine this takes lots of practice.
So there are some, so I think a few years ago, when these sites were measuring facial action and verbal pitch and inflection, there were some sites, and they're still around, that helped to do that. And they actually had an enthusiasm meter for some. So Quincia is one. I could write these in the Quincia was one, and VMOC. These are quite common among Career Center folks like me. But I think they do offer direct to consumer offerings. I know VMOC does. And I don't really know that they're valuable anymore now that the major vendors have really retracted to just word choice. All of these other measures they're just kind of like a parlor game to me. Like, okay, well, it's nice to know that I have enthusiasm in my voice, but it isn't really going to impact my interview result. So no, I think really the way to practice is to go through these kinds of reflection questions and get the labels for those favorites and preferences you have, and keep those and use those in your interview. Tape them around the bezel of your computer so that you can pepper them into your response.
Well, that is a huge advantage, especially I think probably with Zoom interviewing overall. You can kind of put those keywords, those key phrases, or things that you want to remember to share about yourself, your skill set, that you can't obviously do in person with somebody the same way seamlessly. So it's a really good thought, because I would imagine that this does take a good amount of practice to really get that tone and tenor correctly, and to really use the vocabulary that you mentioned to make it a successful interview. Yeah. We had another question come in, which is, do accessories and backgrounds make a difference in how the algorithm rates a candidate? So of course I have the city of Chicago behind me. So does that give me additional points because it's the best city in the country?
No, because they're not looking at the visual anymore. It used to. There have been classic studies about how the background would affect how an AI system would look at an image. But since they're not considering that anymore, that has nothing to do with it. And your lighting won't matter. It's just make sure that you are clear and concise and coherent. Conciseness, succinctness will take care of itself, because you've got 3 minutes. So whether or not you use it all doesn't matter, but your coherent response is really the only thing that you need to worry about.
It's almost a bunch of series of 3-minute elevator pitches in many ways.
Yeah.
Another question, are personality traits a good predictor of job success in general?
They are good enough for a rough screening. So, and compared to other kinds of personality tests, they actually do rank pretty well. So the validity scores that they get, that science is a little beyond me, so I don't want to be quoting percentages there. But if anybody wanted to contact me, I do have an explainability statement from HireVue that does give those kinds of things. Let me do that now. I'll put my information into the chat.
Oh, great. Thank you. While you're doing that, we had another question come in that I also was thinking about. The question is, does AI rate your accent? And I wonder how it does adjust for different accents, and particularly if, assuming if the interview is in English and English is not your first language.
So that is an open question. And that is the only bias that is left, since they're only measuring words. And there could be transcription errors. And I don't know how they have been able to work around strong accents. I wouldn't be able to know.
It'd be interesting to watch to see how that develops, because in many places you can take, for example, the driver's ed test, you can take it in different languages. So it'd be interesting to see if they allow people that, if English, again, assuming that the interview is in English, if it's not, that's not somebody's first language, if they could use their native language.
Yeah, I was just about to say that yes, they do have these interviews in different languages. So I think that would be the solution. That would be the fairest thing to do.
Great. So another question that came in is, how is the validity of AI interviewing measured? Really, I think, how our employers know if it's working?
Oh, well, from my understanding, they are mostly just taking a face value gauge of it. Okay. I don't know that there are specific measures for this, though. Since I'm not on the employer side, but they have a trust factor that, okay, we are getting better quality candidates from this system. So than we would do, or we used to have on our own. I know that they have been measuring diversity, though, in some organizations. Are our slate of candidates more diverse than they used to be? Meaning, are there more candidates who make the final round who come from minority backgrounds than there used to be? And they have found that to be true, but I think you don't see a lot of publicity about that, because this is just one undertaking an employer can use. And when they're trying to create more diverse recruiting efforts, there usually is a whole slate of options that they pursue. So it's sometimes hard to isolate one over the other. So that's why I know HireVue for instance, doesn't claim necessarily directly that they can increase diversity, but they have pointed to their customers who say so. So I think that's the safest way, because I don't know how you could isolate that very well.
This would be a whole other talk, but I think it'd be interesting to sort of measure from a diversity standpoint in your candidate pool, and if it's a stronger candidate pool, but then also the longevity of somebody staying at a company or in a career and moving up in that career. This could be a whole PhD study for somebody that is wanting to work on that. Another question that came in, and I think you touched a little bit upon this, but which major employers are currently using the technology that are out there right now? And it's just, if you know you're going to apply for here, this is the first step in the.
Oh my gosh, there's just too many. I think if you were to go onto those sites, they would certainly be bragging about their employer base.
But, so maybe that's the recommendation, that people should go onto those sites, especially if they're applying to a large company, to see.
Yeah, I mean, you can pretty much count on a lot of the non-degreed, like retail and hospitality positions are using this. And if you want to practice, this is actually a great way to do it. I did that. I created a resume for a front desk clerk at Marriott and sent it in. And I got an email saying, thank you for applying. We'd like you to take this this automated video. Please complete it in 3 days, whatever that amount of time was. So you can pretty much count on those kinds of industries, because they are front-facing many of those positions. I think the professional jobs and the internships are the next rung of positions that will experience this, because they're just more uniform positions. It's not as much variety, and there's not as much individualism you're bringing to that. But oh gosh, I could. In Chicago, I don't know which ones. I don't know about that, but pretty much you can count on any company that's hiring thousands of people at once that has tried this at least or thought about it.
Mhm. It's really interesting that the last question I think we have time for that came in is, can companies create settings to ensure their teams have diverse skills and personalities? So as they're setting up their AI platform or program, are they able to change the settings a little bit to ensure that they get?
No, that's a good question. One of the benefits is the structured interview, right? It's probably the most impact on whether the interview is successful, is that the questions are standardized and delivered in the same way to each candidate. And each role is customized with its own algorithm. So you wouldn't use an algorithm for another role. They would reconfigure it. Those are the consultation fees that the large companies are willing to pay for now, because they're the early adopters. What I think is going to happen is, I don't see the mid-tier companies paying consulting fees to customize those algorithms. That's, probably tens of thousands of dollars to do that. So what will probably happen is they'll use a pre-built from somebody else. They'll say, okay, well, this company is near enough to ours. Maybe we'll use that. Right? These vendors offer these pre-built models for each specific type of occupation. And so, I don't know. I mean, that's a little less diversity in terms of the company's way of doing business. It's sort of like how vernacular now has become somewhat standardized through the US, and we all speak in this kind of Midwest accent, with kind of the same parallel.
See, like, as I said, Chicago, best city in the world, and now everyone wants our accent. It's very
Yeah.
Thank you, Alan, so much. I know when we first chatted about doing this program, it was just a whole new world I really didn't know anything about. And so this has been such an incredibly informative session, and appreciate all of your time. And we're so proud that you are a two-time alumnus. And I also want to mention that you are part of our alumni coaching network. And so if anybody wanted to connect with Alan directly and get some professional advice, there is that option to do that through our website. Also, similarly, if you are not aware, because we just launched this, UIC launched a new online AI programming and engineering. It has been described as a well-designed blend of modern machine intelligent principles, techniques, and strategies. We'll go ahead and or there's a link already in the chat. So if you're interested to learn more about our new AI program and engineering, just thought it was apropos considering this topic. And finally, to close us out, please join us for our next Alumni Exchange program on June 15th at noon Central Time. Not everyone is meant to be an entrepreneur, but there are lessons from the entrepreneurial journey that we can all apply to our career paths and be more successful. Alumnus Robert Sims will lead us through how to integrate business planning and an entrepreneurial mindset to help overcome roadblocks for personal and professional success, as he presents taking an entrepreneurial approach to your career, as we are celebrating Alumni Career Month this month. And so all of our Alumni Exchange programming is focused on helping you develop your career and professional development. You can find a recording of past episodes and this episode's on our website at go.uic.edu/alumni exchange. And of course, please be on the lookout for that brief survey that I mentioned at the beginning. Thank you again, Alan. We really appreciate all of your time in this wonderful presentation today and conversation. We appreciate all of you for being here. We look forward to seeing all of you at a future Alumni Exchange event. Thanks so much and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.